In today's video, I want to show you how to knit a blanket design that I've named Emily. Emily is a great blanket to tackle if you are an adventurous beginner because at just an 8-row repeat, it's a nice short repeat to get to grips with, and also it's only an 8-stitch repeat, so there's not too long a stitch repeat to get to grips with while you're knitting your rows. To knit a blanket the same size as mine, that's 60 centimeters wide by 80 centimeters long, you're going to need about 400 grams of double knit yarn. If you are not in the UK and you want to use a different weight of yarn or an equivalent weight of yarn, double knit is equivalent to 3-weight yarn or also very similar to light worsted weight yarn. You are also going to need some circular knitting needles, 4mm in diameter and at least 100 centimeters long. You can't really knit this blanket on straight needles because your stitches that you cast on won't fit on the length of needles that you'd often find in common straight needle sizes. Then you are also going to need some embroidery scissors and some tapestry needles for sewing in your ends. And then last but not least, you're going to need 2 stitch markers, and we use these to mark where our side borders start and end and where our textured panel also starts and ends. It just makes working your rows so much easier because you don't have to worry about where the transition is. For my blankets, I like to give you the pattern multiple for that middle textured panel separately to the stitches that you cast on for your border. That just gives you freedom to change the border as you wish, but still have the correct pattern multiple for that middle textured panel. Now in the case of Emily, that pattern multiple is 8 plus 1, and then after you've done that, you are going to add on your 18 stitches for your borders. That's 9 for each side. So you want to cast on first of all a number that is a multiple of 8. If it makes it easy, you can just count 8, 8, 8, 8, 8 until you have the number of stitches that you want. Then you are going to add 1 stitch on, and after that you are going to cast on an additional 18 stitches for those side borders. If you want to replicate the blanket that I showed you in the introduction, you are going to need to cast on a total of 131 stitches. That number includes the 18 stitches for your side borders, so the 131 is the total number of stitches you're going to cast on. As always, I like to use the long tail cast on method, but if you have a method that you prefer, please feel free to use it. The pattern will still work. This blanket is knitted from bottom to top, so that means that the first section that we are going to need to tackle is that bottom garter stitch border. This section is really nice and easy. It consists of 16 rows worked in exactly the same way, and all of your stitches, with the exception of the final stitch in each row, are knit stitches. I'll walk you through the first row and then I'm going to leave you to carry on and work rows 2 to 16 yourself. First things first, you are going to want to knit your way across your row until you have just 1 stitch left to work on your left hand needle. We work that stitch slightly differently as our selvage stitch, and what that does is it gives us a really nice, neat, long side edge that has a slight braided effect rather than just having raw garter stitch up the edges. If you prefer not to add this in, that's fine too. It's just a technique that I like to use because I feel that it gives me a really nice, neat side edge. So knit your way along until you have just 1 stitch left to work. The technique we're going to use for this final stitch in the row is called slipping 1 purlwise with the yarn in front. So the first step that you need to take with this technique is to get your yarn to the front of your work. I'm a continental knitter, so I just lift and hold that working yarn to the front of my work while I work the stitch, but if you prefer to lift that working yarn all the way to the front, then just do that. That is perfectly fine as well. Once you've lifted your working yarn to the front of your work, you're going to get your right hand needle and pop it into the stitch from right through to left. So you don't want to twist your stitch by putting it in as if to knit, so from left to right. You're going to go into the stitch in the same way that you would with a purl stitch, from right through to left, and slide it onto your right hand needle. Once it's firmly on your right hand needle, you can remove your left hand needle, and if, like me, you have held your working yarn with the right hand needle, you're just going to want to lift it over your needle and make sure that it is at the front of your work. So that's row 1 of 16 done. I will leave you now to go away and work rows 2 to 16 yourself in exactly the same way, and I will go away and do the same, and then I will rejoin you at the end of row 16 and show you how we tackle that middle textured panel that forms the bulk of our blanket. At the end of your 16th row, on the side that is facing you after you've finished your row, you should be able to count 8 garter ridges, not including this smooth cast on edge. Now that we have worked our bottom garter stitch border, we're ready to jump into the 8 row repeat that forms the bulk of our blanket and creates that lovely textured middle panel. The first time we work row 1, we're going to do a little bit of setup work to place our stitch markers to mark our side borders, but every time you work row 1 after the first time, you're just going to slip your markers over from one needle to the next instead of placing them. For this blanket, all of our odd numbered rows are wrong side rows. What that means is as your blanket grows, the wrong side of your work will be facing you when you work an odd numbered row, and when you work an even numbered row, the right side will be facing you and your textured panel will be clearly facing upwards at you during those even numbered rows. To start row 1, you want to knit 9 stitches. Then you're going to grab the first of your 2 stitch markers and you're going to pop it onto your right hand needle. Next, you are going to purl your way across your row until you have 9 stitches left on your left hand needle, so that will equate to being 9 stitches before the end of the row. Once you've got those 9 stitches left to work at the end of the row, you're going to grab the second of your 2 stitch markers, and just like we did at the other end of the row, you're going to pop that onto your right hand needle. Carry on then and knit the next 8 stitches. That should leave you with 1 stitch left to work, and just like we did for our bottom garter stitch border, we're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 2 is really nice and simple. You are just going to knit your way all the way across the row and knit every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch in the row. When you get to your stitch markers, you are going to slip them over from your left needle to your right needle. And when you get to that very last stitch of the row, just like we have been doing for the other rows so far, you are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 3 starts by knitting the 9 stitches until you hit your first stitch marker. Slip your marker over, and then you are going to purl all the stitches until you reach your next marker. So all the stitches in between your 2 stitch markers are purl stitches. When you reach your second stitch marker, you're going to slip it over from one needle to the next, and then you are going to knit the next 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 4 starts again by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip your marker over, and then you are going to purl the first stitch. Now you're going to jump into an 8 stitch repeat that you're going to repeat all the way along your row until you hit your second stitch marker, and that 8 stitch repeat goes as follows. You are going to knit 7, and then purl 1. And you're going to repeat that combination of knit 7, purl 1 until you hit your second marker, and if you count your stitches correctly, you should hit that point after you have worked a purl 1. Slip that second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. That leaves us with the selvage stitch at the end of the row, and you are going to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 5 starts by knitting 9 stitches, and that should take you to your first stitch marker. Slip the marker over, and then you are going to purl 1 stitch. Now we're going to jump into an 8 stitch repeat. It's a little more complex than the 8 stitch repeat in the previous row, but it's still fairly easy to get to grips with. You are going to knit 1, purl 5, knit 1, and then purl 1. Let's just do that once more. So you are going to knit 1, purl 5, knit 1, and then purl 1. And you're going to repeat that 8 stitch repeat all the way along your row until you hit your second marker. And if you've counted your stitches correctly, that should be at the end of a repeat, so you should hit your second stitch marker after a purl 1. When you reach it, you're going to slip your second marker over from one needle to the next, and you're going to carry on and knit the next 8 stitches. Finish your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 6 starts with knitting the 9 stitches that make up your side garter stitch border. Slip the marker over, and then you are going to knit 2 stitches. Next, you're going to purl 1 stitch, and now you're going to repeat a 4 stitch repeat all the way across until 2 stitches before this second marker. And that 4 stitch repeat goes as follows. You are going to knit 3 and purl 1. Just once more, that's knit 3 and purl 1 until 2 stitches before your second marker. These final 2 stitches before that second marker, you are going to knit. Then slip your marker over and knit the next 8 stitches. Last but not least, you are going to slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Start row 7 by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip your marker over from one needle to the next, and then you're going to purl the next 3 stitches. Next, you're going to knit 1 stitch, purl 1 stitch, and knit 1 more stitch. And now you're going to jump into an 8 stitch repeat that you're going to work until 3 stitches before your second marker. And that 8 stitch repeat goes as follows. You are going to purl 5, then you're going to knit 1, purl 1, and knit 1 more. And you're going to repeat that block of 8 stitches until 3 stitches before your second marker. These 3 stitches before your second marker, you are going to purl. Next, you want to slip that marker over from one needle to the next and carry on and knit 8 more stitches. That should then leave you with just your final stitch of the row to work, and just like we have been doing for the rest of this project, we're going to slip it purlwise and pop the yarn in front. Row 8 is the final row of our repeat, and you're going to start by knitting 9 stitches. Slip your marker over when you get to it and carry on and knit 4 more stitches. Then you are going to purl 1 stitch, and now you're going to jump into an 8 stitch repeat that you're going to repeat until 4 stitches before that second stitch marker, and that repeat goes as follows. You are going to knit 7, and purl 1. And you're going to repeat that block of 8 all the way across until 4 stitches before that second marker, and that's where I will rejoin you. These 4 stitches before your second marker, you are going to knit. Slip that marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. That should leave one final stitch, and you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. These 8 rows form the building blocks of our blanket, so you would now go back to the beginning of the repeat with row 1 and work rows 1 to 8 all the way through again, and you repeat them as many times as you need to until the overall length of your project is about 5 centimeters shorter than you want the finished item to be. In my case, if you're wanting to replicate a blanket like mine, 60 centimeters wide by about 80 centimeters long, you're going to want to repeat that block of 8 rows a total of 28 times. Once you've done that, to get your little symmetry with your stockinette top and bottom before your chevrons, you're going to want to repeat rows 1 to 3 of the pattern once more, and that will give you symmetry top and bottom. Once you've done that, we're going to be ready to move on to the top garter stitch border. So I'm going to go away now and work rows 1 to 3 once more before I move on and show you how to knit that top garter stitch border. Your top garter stitch border is worked in exactly the same way as the bottom garter stitch border, and just like the bottom border, it consists of 16 rows worked in exactly the same way. The first row of your border should be a right side row, so you should have your textured panel facing you as you start your row, and you are just going to work knit stitches all the way across with the exception of that final stitch. So just like with the beginning of our blanket with that bottom garter stitch border, every stitch except that selvage stitch is a knit stitch. Now on this first row of the border, when you get to your stitch markers, you can remove them because we don't need to mark our side borders anymore, and you're just going to carry on and knit all the way across your row. This final stitch of the row should be really familiar to you now because we've worked it in the same way for the whole of the blanket, and you are just going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. So that's row 1 of 16 done. I'm going to go away and work rows 2 to 16 myself, and I'm going to leave you to do the same, and then I will rejoin you at the end of row 16 and show you how we tackle that cast off and get this blanket from a work in progress on our needles to something that can be gifted. The last row of any knitted project is the cast off row, and for my blankets I like to use a really nice basic knitted cast off. It's really simple to do and it looks really good. If you are new to this cast off, I do have a beginner friendly video that goes over it in really nice slow steps, but for the purpose of this video I'm just going to work the first few stitches and then leave you to carry on with the rest of the cast off yourself. To start your cast off row, you are going to knit 2 stitches. Keep your stitches fairly nice and loose because if your tension is too tight, your cast off will pull in and your blanket won't lay nice and flat. Once you've got 2 stitches on your right hand needle, you're going to grab your left hand needle and pop it into the first stitch that you worked from left through to right. Then you want to pop your index finger on the other stitch that you worked, and then you're going to use this left hand needle to lift that first stitch up and over the second stitch and then completely off your needles, and you will have gone from 2 stitches on this right hand needle down to 1. Then you are going to knit 1 more stitch so that you go back up to 2 stitches on that right hand needle, and then you're going to repeat the process again. Pop your left hand needle through that first stitch on your right hand needle from left through to right, and then pick it up and lift it all the way up and off your needle, and so that you've gone back down to 1 stitch. And you're going to repeat that process of knitting 1 and lifting 1 all the way along your row until you have no stitches left to work on this left hand needle and just 1 stitch left on your right hand needle, and that is the point that I will rejoin you. When you are left with just this final stitch on your right hand needle, you can break your yarn. Make sure that you leave yourself a decent amount of tail, at least 20 centimeters, so that you can sew in your ends. And then to secure this final stitch, what I like to do is pull up to make this final stitch nice and big. At this point you can get rid of your knitting needles, we don't need those anymore. Then I put my finger and my thumb through that stitch and grab the tail, and I pull it all the way through. Then I'm going to tug to tighten and to make that stitch nice and small and give it a firm tug, and what that does is secure that final stitch nice and neatly, and then when you sew in your tail you can't even see that extra lump is there. A couple of final bits and bobs from me before I leave you to your knitting. If you are somebody that likes a written version of this pattern, then as always I have a free version on my blog, and if you want something to print away and take away with you, then I also have a ad-free PDF that you can purchase for a small fee, and I've left all those links on my website. I often get asked if a blanket design is reversible, and as is the case with many stockinette blankets that you find, Emily is not a reversible design, so you can see that on the reverse of the blanket there is no real clear defined pattern, and the texture that you get is predominantly on this right side. Last but not least, you can knit this blanket in any weight yarn that you like. You are just going to need to use that pattern multiple to adjust the amount of stitches that you cast on, and you also might need to work more or less repeats depending on the weight of yarn that you choose. All that's left to do now is to wish you happy knitting and to leave you with another project that might inspire you if this one doesn't quite take your fancy.